conversation question we're talking about today is we're talking about moving beyond where are you from. We're not going to just have a boring lesson answering where are you from because I hate that question and I'll tell you why in just a moment. The where are you from question is such a loaded question, which is when we say a question is loaded, it means that your answer can really influence the way that the conversation goes. And you really have to understand a little bit about why the person's asking you, where are you from? Something funny about this YouTube channel is a lot of times people are commenting, hey, Cam, where are you from? Where were you born? And I'm kind of confused because I'm like, I'm a native English speaker. Like, do you think I was born somewhere else? Do I sound like I have an accent? I get kind of confused when people ask me where I'm from. So it can be a difficult question to answer for a lot of people. So let me just give you some background on the question, where are you from? If you have even the slightest accent or even a behavior that suggests you're not a local, you're likely to be asked, where are you from? People can't resist their curiosity and they want to know more about your accent. This is the same if you are an American and you're, for example, I'm from New England, which is the northeast of the United States near Boston. And so when I go to the South or I go to Texas, people hear my accent and they're like, where are you from? Because I'm not from that area. People are always trying to identify where you're from. Or even if you travel to another English-speaking country, people are going to ask. I know a lot of my accent reduction clients, my accent training clients, they've been able to reduce their accent so that they have this kind of non-obvious accent. Like sometimes you hear an accent, you're like, that person's clearly from Brazil, for example. That person's clearly from a Spanish-speaking country. That person's clearly French. You can hear their accent. But when you reduce your accent, the goal is to kind of have a neutral, not obvious accent that eventually you'll try to reduce to an American accent. But that can be more interesting because people look at you and they're like, where are you from? I have no clue where you're from. So I know a lot of you guys, because you always tell me in these live lessons where you're from, I know a lot of people feel so happy to talk about their country and they have pride in their heritage, which you should. Everyone should be proud. It was 4th of July yesterday. For all the good things and the bad things about the United States, I am American and I'm proud to be American. So you want to consider your answer to this question based on the situation. So if you're having some sort of casual conversation with somebody, someone asking you where are you from may not be something that's like, oh, goodness, why do I have to talk about this? So your answer is really going to vary based on your read, your kind of intuition and your feelings about the situation. Because if you sense that the person's going to be aggressive, they're somebody who's anti-immigrant, for example, in the United States, there are not nice people who exist, then maybe you don't want to answer. You just want to avoid the conversation. But if they're genuinely interested in getting to know you, then that's when you're going to volunteer where you're from and maybe use that in order to start a conversation. So I hope this is making sense to you guys as we go through that. Oh, this is so like I said, people are going to ask you, where are you from, as soon as they detect an accent. And I'm sure you guys can tell me in the chat or the comments, do you ask people, like for example, we have so many Brazilians and you notice a lot of them are specifying their city because you can hear a different Brazilian accent. Someone from Sao Paulo has a different accent than someone from Rio or someone from Bahia, someone from Curitiba. So all of these different accents are going to be obvious to a person within the country, and the same as in the United States. So when someone asks you, where are you from, don't view it as an attack, even though sometimes it feels like, oh no, now I have to tell my story. So this is something I really want to explain a little bit about my background. Personally, I get a little frustrated when people ask me, where are you from? Because I don't really have an easy answer to that question. I'm originally from New Hampshire, which is in New England near Boston. But most of the time, if I'm in another country, people have no idea where that is. So I always say I'm from Boston, especially because as an adult, I've spent more years living in Boston. But I also lived in New York City. I lived in San Diego. I lived in South America. I lived in Buenos Aires and Lima, Peru, and the north of Chile. So I've lived in a lot of different places. So when someone asks me, where are you from? I feel like this tension because I feel like I can't explain that. And I know some of you might feel that way, especially if you've been living in another country. I know a lot of my Brazilian students here on YouTube are living in Europe, for example. And a lot of times people live in a different area. Sometimes if you're older, you might have had to leave your country during a time of trouble, a time of war, a time of I don't know, dictatorship. There's a lot of reasons people leave the country. So I understand that the question, where are you from, can be a challenging question to answer. So you let me know in the live chat or later in the comments if this is something you feel sometimes. Personally, I find it hard to really explain where I'm from. Obviously, I was raised American, but other people maybe they were born in, let's say, India. They lived there until age 6 or 10, and then they moved to the United States, and they feel much more American than they feel Indian because they grew up in the United States. So this is something, when you ask somebody, where are you from, and you get a weird response like you would probably get from me, it's because it's not an easy answer. One of my good friends from college, her father worked for the military, and so they lived in maybe 10 or 12 different cities while she was growing up. So when someone asks her where she's from in the United States, she's like, well, I moved around a lot. And that's a good expression to practice. I moved around a lot. Or if you are, a lot of times it's frustrating if you were originally born in one country, but you lived most of your adult or your young adult life in another country, you may not feel one of my good friends from New York is originally from China, and he moved here when he was 14. And so he might still have a tiny little, very not noticeable accent, but he feels a little frustrated by the question because, of course, he has the Chinese heritage and feels proud of it. But he might also be able to, feel more American because he grew up in the United States as an adult. So this is a great question to talk about. So I want you guys to tell me if you've ever had this challenge explaining where you're from, if you've ever wanted to explain where you're from in a different way. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How can we move beyond the question, where are you from, and be able to use it in order to start a conversation and really reveal the parts of you and your life that you want other people to know. So I hope that makes sense to you guys. And I see you guys commenting there. I'll come back to the live chat in a moment. I just want to make sure we get the lesson there first. Okay. So how can we answer this question? Let's talk about it. Someone asks you, where are you from? And you're like, maybe it's an easy answer. Let's make it a better answer. Or maybe it's a challenging answer. So something that people, if you're living in another country, it's a good idea if someone asks you, where are you from, to immediately tell them that you live in this country. So I mentioned to one of you guys in the live chat that I used to live in Chile, and I also used to live in Peru. And a lot of times people would ask me, okay, you're speaking English, where are you from? And the reason, or not speaking English, you have an English accent or an American accent when you speak Spanish. And so I would usually say, well, I'm originally from the Boston area, or Boston in the United States, but I live here, or if you're traveling, I live in another city or another country. The reason you want to use the word originally is that talks about your country of origin, and using the word originally makes you sound more natural. Especially because it's such a global world, and this is only going to continue to become more global, when you say originally, I'm originally from this country, or I'm originally from Boston, but I now live in California. I might answer that way because people might hear my somewhat Bostonian vowels or something like that, right? Or I'm originally from Boston, but I live in Lima. So I would always answer that question because that would start the conversation going about my experience in the country. If you're traveling, you can just say, I'm from this place. Now, I just want you to use this if you're living in another country and you feel like, you want to prove that you have this experience, for example, with Europe, or you're living in Asia or Australia or the US or Canada, you might want to explain that your goal is to live in the country, that you're kind of part of this country too. This really depends on you. It depends on the conversation. It depends on the kind of interaction you're having. But you want to say, I'm originally from this place, but I live in this place. You might even say this if you moved within your own country. Like I say, I'm originally from Boston, but I live in San Diego. I mean, I don't live there now, but when I did, I would say, but now I live in San Diego, because it's hard to really explain in a short time based on the conversation what's the best response. Okay, so the other thing I want to encourage you guys when you're answering this kind of boring question is, instead of just answering, I'm from Brazil, done. Like, I want you to be able to answer with more details, right? So I want you to think about, And a lot of you guys are doing this, especially even if you're from a small country and there's, like it's only an hour between, somebody from Montenegro or something like that. And they're like, it's a really small country. It's fine. Just give more information about the country. If people might not know where it is, they might not be that familiar with, for example, the geography of Africa. Not a lot of people, because there's so many countries in Africa, really know that much about it in the United States. So you want to give more details. So when somebody asks you, where are you from? Don't just say, I'm from Brazil, and then close your mouth, right? I want you to say more information. Lead with your city or your region of the country and share a couple of details to help the person locate it in their memory or kind of remember you through what you're explaining. So for example, the example I had is about Brazil. I'm from Bahia in the north of Brazil, where they have amazing music. It's near whatever major city, right? So sometimes I think Curitiba in Brazil is near Sao Paulo. So a lot of times when people say Curitiba, they say, but it's near Sao Paulo, because most Americans can kind of locate in their memory that Sao Paulo is a major city in Brazil. So try to give a little more information. So for example, when I was living temporarily in northern Chile, I would say, well, I live in the Valle de Elqui. I live in the Elqui Valley, which is near Santiago, about 6 hours from Santiago. And you give people some information, so they're like, oh, okay, like you're near the capital. Like they can kind of be able to respond to that. The same thing I would do if I'm explaining where I'm from in the US. I don't say I'm from, my original town. I'm from a small town, so nobody knows where it is unless they know about New Hampshire and that particular region of New Hampshire. So I would say I'm from about an hour outside Boston. I grew up in the Boston area. I grew up in New England. Whatever it is, I'm originally from this part, and I give more details. I'm from where independence started in the United States, right? The Freedom Trail in Boston. So I hope this is making sense to you guys. So give me more details than just your country. Tell me your city. Tell me where you're originally from and if you moved. And then tell me some sort of detail that might be able to give the person more information. So like I said, it is okay if you have trouble answering this question because it's complicated. I have trouble answering this question too. And it might just be complicated for you emotionally, right? It might not be that weird for other people, like, oh, like you've moved, Kim, no big deal. But for me, it's hard to answer that question easily. So give more information, be able to give the person a little more details to keep the conversation going. Time out. I need to breathe. Okay, slow down. This is just so fun. I really got excited about this lesson, so I'm happy to see you guys participating. Okay. So, like I said, when answering this question, give more information. Tell them about the region, right? Like a lot of you guys have been doing in the live chat. Tell them a little bit about, something they might recognize from your country. So a lot of people remember Boston. They may have heard of the Boston Red Sox. Maybe they know something about the Freedom Trail, the history of, the independence from Britain. And this is great for those of you guys who are saying Happy 4th of July, because this is recorded July 5th. So try to think of something that they might remember. Maybe they recognize Harvard University. I used to live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where Harvard University is. It's kind of next to Boston. It's like Boston, greater Boston. So something that will help the person recognize. I used to walk to Harvard University. So some people are like, oh, Harvard, how cool. It's a place where you can walk all the time. So that's important to think about. Like, how can you make the person remember something about your area? So for example, we were talking about me living in San Diego. I don't live there now, but I used to. And I could say, I'm from San Diego. It's about 30 minutes from the border with Mexico. It's where there's really good surfing. It has beautiful sunsets. Just something that will help the person remember you and remember something about your country or your city rather. And this will also keep the conversation going, which is why this is moving beyond where are you from. We're trying to get past this question to something a little more interesting. Now, something I want you guys to understand about the question, where are you from, is that when someone asks, where are you from, they might actually be curious about your ethnic background. And this is a situation that happens a lot in the United States because obviously, I'm very stereotypically looking American, right? Maybe if I were blonde, it would make more sense. So when somebody asks about that, they might want to know something about maybe you have a really interesting skin color or tone, right? And they want to know a little more about your story. But they're asking, where are you from? Because this is a safe question. Now, it's important to understand that for Americans whose parents are or grandparents are originally from another country, this question can seem offensive. And this is also really important for you guys to know. If you're meeting an American who's Asian, who's Black, who's Latino, American, like a born in the United States American, they're all American, Indian American, right? It doesn't matter what the background is. You want to make sure when you ask, where are you from? Like, if they answer, I'm from the United States, you're not like, no. But your skin, where are you from? That's not polite in the United States. You want to be able to ask the person, okay, they're going to tell you, like, hey, I'm from New York. I was born in the United States, right? My great grandparents were immigrants to the United States. And so, like, my parents were born here, my grandparents were born here. But, like, you're still American if you were born here, and you're still American. A lot of people who are citizens of the United States, now they think they're from the United States because they've taken on that citizenship. So I want you to be careful when you're asking an American or you're asking someone who's from any country, really, where there's, their parents were immigrants years ago, or their grandparents or their great-grandparents or their great-great-great-grandparents. Be careful with the question, where are you from? Because if you meet an Asian American and you say, where are you from? And they're like, I'm from the United States. I'm from Boston. And you're like, no, but where are you really from? They're really from the United States. So I just want to give you that cultural understanding that if you push, that's not really the question that you're asking. You're asking about their parents' story, their grandparents' story, and it may not be the right situation to have this conversation. So you guys let me know in the chat if you've had that situation happen, or if it's, something that that you understand, that you feel more confident now that I've explained that to you guys. And I will get back to you guys in the live chat. I see you guys chatting there, and I'm excited to see that. Okay. So if you're in a conversation situation where you can have this kind of conversation, where you have trust with the person, it's later in small talk, then you might want to ask about their person's heritage or their ancestry. So here's what I suggest in this situation. You want to be sensitive to the other person and maybe share some information about your family first, right? So for example, I mentioned my relatives. Right now, my mom, my uncle, and then my mom's cousins, they're all researching the history of my great grandparents. So her grandparents were immigrants. So my mom's grandparents. So they're researching because they don't know very much about their stories, where they're from, what the background is. So there are many generations of Americans that have been here for 300 years, but they want to know more information about their ancestry. So if you're curious about somebody's background, then you might want to share about your background. For example, in Brazil, if we think about Gisele Bündchen, however you say her name, she's a Brazilian model, but her background is German, right? And so they might want to know a little more about that particular background. And so if you want to get information from someone else about their grandparents and you're curious about their history, then make sure that you volunteer information first, because then you're saying, wow, I'm from Brazil, but my grandparents are from Germany, or I'm from, Argentina, but my family is originally from Italy a couple generations ago. Give that information first, and then you might get into this really fascinating conversation about where we're from, where we're going. Especially if you're living in another country, it's fascinating to track the way that people move around the world. And that's something to understand when someone asks, where are you from? The goal of all of these types of questions is really to give you a chance to not only answer the questions with feeling confident about your answer, but it's able to keep the conversation going. And if you've watched any of my videos, my goal through everything I try to teach you guys is really to help you be able to keep the conversation going. Something I really want you to understand through these live video lessons is that keeping the conversation going is not about a perfect answer. It's not about asking the best questions all of the time. It's about continuing the conversation and also leaving the person opportunities to ask you more questions. So you're basically setting up the other person to ask you additional questions to keep the conversation going and the conversation flowing. So I see that in the chat box, we've kind of slowed down a little bit. So let's keep it going in order to show you how you can take this simple question, where are you from? Kind of a boring, lazy question, if you ask me, and turn it into more of a conversation. So something that people have asked me a lot when I live abroad, and people probably ask you if you live abroad or travel abroad, is people love to know, what do you think of my country? People love to hear their perceptions of their country abroad. I know Brazilians do this all the time, Chileans do this all the time. They want to know, what do you think of me, right? What's your opinion of me? A lot of times Americans aren't necessarily that interested in what do you think of my country, because we have, with Hollywood and all the TV shows, people are kind of familiar with the United States. A lot of times my challenge as an American when I live abroad is having to tell people that Americans aren't really that way. Like back in the day when Friends was really popular, it's like Americans in New York don't live in nice apartments. My apartment did not look like that when I lived in New York. So I want you guys to think about that. Like, think about, if you ask somebody, what do you think about my country? Maybe be more specific than asking that. So some question people ask, how does Boston compare to Sao Paulo? They want to get more details. When somebody asks you a question like, how does Boston compare? They want more specifics. Like, what do you like about each place? And like, what's something that you see in common? Or how can I understand someplace I've never been through your response? People may also ask you something simple like, how do you like living here, right? Which is kind of another boring question, but it's an easy question for someone you don't know. Or what do you think about this city, right? If you're traveling, for example, let's say you're traveling and you're in Germany and you're in Berlin and somebody asks, well, what do you think of my city? Like, how's your experience been here? People love hearing that you've had a positive experience, that you've been curious about learning about the culture, learning about the story of the country. So that's the kind of answer you really want to be going for. So keep going with that as well. Okay, and then the other thing when somebody asks that question is that you want to pay attention to where the conversation is going. If the conversation seems to be leading if it's small talk, like at a bus stop, you might just want to say, oh yeah, I'm originally from Sao Paulo in Brazil, but I'm living here in Boston. End of the conversation, no more. But if you want to keep the conversation going, you're at a party, a networking event, it seems like a good person to talk to, then you want to kind of continue to build by asking additional questions or either asking the other person questions or giving more details. I notice a lot of times in these chat boxes, people often ask, have you been to my country? Do you know anything about my country, right? They want to know what I think of you guys. But, if let's say you're living in the United States, like you might want to give it's kind of weird when you're like, have you been to Brazil? And you're in the United States, right? Because it's like, well, maybe not. And then they feel kind of sad that they haven't been to the country. So you're welcome to ask, have you been to that region of the world? Have you been to Europe? Have you been to South America? Like maybe broaden it. Have you been to Africa? Have you been to the Middle East? Have you been to Southeast Asia? Have you been to Asia? Have you been to Russia? Ask a question that's a little broader so that the person can kind of compare with something related to your country or related to the cultures around your country, because then it gives them more of a chance to answer the question rather than like, have you been to Brazil? No. But maybe they've been to, Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela. They've been to other countries, and you can have a conversation about the similarities and differences between the two countries. So steer the conversation. You're in charge of this conversation. Get it going the way that you want. So if you're being asked this question, where are you from? And you want to make it a little more interesting. This is where you want to really focus down on where you're living or where you're traveling. So if you're living in the same city as the person who's asking you, it's a good idea to direct the conversation to asking more questions about the city. Even if you're visiting or you're here temporarily, you're doing an exchange program, try to steer the conversation into that particular direction. Like try to focus more on what you have in common rather than what your differences are. That's why I said ask about bigger regions than just your city or your country. Like ask about, and then you can get into it and maybe invite the person to visit you some other time. People love sharing wisdom about their home cities or their home regions or their home countries. So if you're in the same country and you guys can have a conversation about it, try to talk about aspects of the city that you both discuss. So after somebody says, where are you from? You say, well, I'm from Germany, but I currently live in New York. And then you say, oh, okay. Like, do you live in New York, to the other person? And then, do you live in this neighborhood? Because there's many neighborhoods in New York. And then you can keep the conversation going. I'm sure if you guys have met Americans living in your countries, that you not only want to hear it like, oh wow, they live in Lima, but like what part of Lima or what area, and then the conversation continues to go further. And then another thing is an easy question. Instead of just saying, where are you from? What brings you to this city, or what brings you to this area? If you want to talk about a region, like what brings you to New England, because New England is kind of smaller, what brings you to this, what brings you to the South, right, of the United States? What brings you to the Pacific Northwest? What brings you to California? You can kind of evolve that conversation beyond what the original question was. And then you can ask somebody, where do you live? What part of town do you live in? Where are you currently living, right? So if somebody is in Boston and they're doing a short exchange, even a month exchange program in a language institute in Boston, then you can say, oh, okay, like, where are you from? Well, I'm from Brazil, but I'm currently here in Boston. Oh, what are you doing in Boston? Oh, I'm studying. Where do you live in Boston? Well, I live in Cambridge, right? And you can give more details and keep the conversation going from there. So the goal of this particular flow of conversation is to give more details, to keep the conversation going, and it's to get the attention off of you and your story. If you don't feel like sharing, it's complicated, whatever that reason that it's not the best question for you is, and then you can bring it to a mutual place of sharing. Now remember, people are going to remember you as a great conversationalist, not because you had a perfect accent, perfect English, perfect answers, but because you shared something in the conversation. I always say here on this channel that my goal is to help you connect in conversations in English. So bringing the focus to your shared city after the where are you from answer, or your shared interest in travel, or your shared knowledge of a particular region can help keep the conversation flowing. Summarize what we've been talking about. We've been talking about the question, where are you from, right? And not just like how to answer it, like I'm from Pakistan, or I'm from, where was this? Okay, another person from Pakistan, right? I'm from this place. How can you tell me the city? And if I won't know your city, if you assume I won't know your city, tell me the region. Tell me something special about your city. For example, if you think about Turkey, for example, there's different cities in Turkey, but there's different parts of the country that people might recognize. The part that has the beaches, the part that has the really cool rugs. You can talk about Turkish tea or Turkish delight candies, right? Give a little more detail about something that's specific to your region. So that the person is able to ask you more questions and keep the conversation going. So give a couple more details, right? Give some more information about what the other person might recognize in order to then continue the conversation on that. Like I said, obviously, if you guys are not living here in the United States, or you're not living in a specific country, it's hard to have a fake conversation. But if some of you are living in the US or you're living in Europe, what would you ask to get the other person talking about their particular region too? Make the question, where are you from, more interactive than just you answering and then the conversation goes silent. The more information you can volunteer in response to this question, the more the conversation is going to evolve. And remember, like I said at the beginning, when you want to answer this question, if you've moved, which you probably have, or you probably will in the future, because this is a very global world, then you could say, I'm originally from Boston, but I currently live in New York, or something like that, right? I'm originally from Pakistan, but I currently live in Australia. Whatever the story is, then you can give more details, because I know for a lot of people, when you answer with your country, it's not the whole story. So you have to judge based on your interaction with the person you're talking to. What do I want them to know about me? What would I like them to continue to learn about me? How do I want this conversation going? And in the other episodes, we've talked about this, setting a conversational goal for your interaction and then keeping it going from there, being able to keep the conversation flowing from there. Thank you once again for joining me for EnglishWithKim.com, for Conversations with Kim. Once again, this was episode 5, where we are talking about how to answer where are you from and move beyond the question where are you from. So if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with a friend if you found it helpful. If you're watching the replay, please be sure to participate by leaving a comment below, answering the questions we've talked about, introducing yourself in a more interesting way. I really do value your participation. I respond to as many comments as I can, and I love getting to know you guys so that when I see your names in these live lessons, I'll be able to respond to you guys and talk to you. The other thing is, if you would like email notifications of these live lessons, YouTube can be a little inconsistent with their notifications. So please, below the video, I'll include a link to sign up for email reminders from me. You'll join my email community and you'll get all the details, all the inside scoop from me. So please sign up for the email reminders and join me in the email community if you haven't already. Trust me, it's worth it. I tell stories about my background and experiences learning English that I don't necessarily share here. And if these videos are quite long for you, there's always some insights in the writing. Okay, let's look at the chat box one more time. Yeah, exactly. So people are just kind of finishing up here. Thank you guys for the thank you. I appreciate you guys. But yeah, you learn a lot from interacting with people from all kinds of backgrounds. So that's the goal with all of these conversation questions, is to really help you understand how to keep the conversation going, how to be more confident when speaking. Remember, your goal is to keep the conversation going, not to answer perfectly. It's to keep asking questions and answering in a way that leaves room for more questions. So I look forward to seeing you for our next episode of Conversations with Kim, and be sure to sign up for the email reminders. Always check the channel page because I do schedule as many live sessions as I can in advance, and I love participating with you guys here. So once again, I am Kim from EnglishWithKim.com. I'm your guide to the essential conversation skills you need to sound more natural in English. Thank you so much for your participation. Give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and I look forward to sharing more tips with you soon. Have a great day. Goodbye.